webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to this webinar delivered by the ISM Trust, and thank you very much for joining us. We are Dr. Alison Daubney and Gregory Daubney. Yes, we are related. We're the authors of the Performance Anxiety, a Practical Guide for Music Teachers. And before we begin today, there are just a few points. Firstly, the content of this presentation is for information purposes only. It isn't intended to be a substitute for legal or other professional services and should not be relied upon as such. You can contact us about your specific situation, and ISM members can also contact the ISM legal team, and our email addresses are on the front of the slides, which you can hopefully see. You can't see me or Greg, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint displayed on your screen. You should also be able to hear me, but I can't hear you. And if you experience any technical difficulties such as sound or quality issues, please let us know in the question box and we'll make attempts to resolve the issues. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. Now, before we start, thinking about the question box, we are going to pick up questions today, and we're very, very happy to answer those, and it's great to make this quite interactive for you to be able to ask things. We're very happy for you to type questions all the way through, and we'll probably pick them up at the end, but if something comes to mind, just pop it in the box and we will go through all of the questions at the end. So off we go. Firstly, I suppose I should say something about who we are. So as I said, my name is Alison Daubney and I'm a teacher and researcher workshop leader. And over the last 20-something years, I've been a school and peripatetic music teacher. I'm on the board of the Brighton Hove Music Education Hub and I work at the University of Sussex. Done lots of work around curriculum and assessment, and mental health kind of came up because I noticed a lot of my students over the years, from preschool to postgraduate, there were things around anxiety that I was coming home, we were discussing over dinner, and then Greg, who is a chartered sport and exercise psychologist, was kind of going, oh yeah, similar things with the sports people I'm working with. So eventually we put everything together and we came up originally with some ideas for music teachers. This has just been kind of revamped and updated, and it's what we're talking about today. So it's the Performance Anxiety Guide for Music Teachers, and then we've held workshops with teachers and groups of teachers, peripatetic teachers, groups of students throughout the UK and actually other places in Europe as well, across 2017, 2018 and 2019. Done lots of practical workshops with music education hubs, which has been great fun, and we've had amazing feedback. So that's good. So this is the guide, this is the link, but the slides will be up online afterwards for you to take a look at.
And so, hello everyone, this is Greg, and as Ali said, I'm a chartered sport and exercise psychologist. And so the question arose, first of all, is, well, why is this resource needed? And as Ali said, I was experiencing seeing clients who were experiencing some forms of performance anxiety, and this was coming across in music as well. So we started to work together, and we noticed that there was generally just a lack of resources, very practical resources in particular, to help music teachers and musicians with handling the nerves of performance anxiety and being able to perform at their best. So what we thought was that we needed some strategies and some practical guidance that teachers and the students could really pick up and just use straight away on a very practical basis. And as we say in the booklet, anxiety is present in all our lives, but the key to successful performance is to actually learn how to handle it effectively. So it's natural in many respects when you're a performer to be nervous and to be anxious. There's a lot often riding on such a performance, so it's a natural state of affairs. Our goal is to provide ways and strategies that can help performers cope with that anxiety, and then they can harness that and make a better performance. So we should start really with, what is music performance anxiety? Well, Kenny in 2010 describes music performance anxiety as the experience of intense and persistent anxious apprehension related to musical performance. And crucially, from this definition are the two aspects relating to the intensity and the persistence of the anxious apprehension. So it's not just something that can flare up and then just drop down straight away. It's something that is generally experienced over a longer period of time, which increases in intensity as the performance time nears and is persistent. So although it can sort of flare up and then go away a little bit, generally it's still sort of lingering over the time leading up to the performance.
So if we look at what we consider a performance to be, and we want to be very clear that the resources we've put together are not aimed specifically at elite performers, that they are aimed at everybody getting something better out of music education. And so they could be large performances, they could be important public performances, they could be examinations, which we know lots of children and adults find very stressful situations. They could be showcases, they could be tests of some sort, they could be rehearsals, and in fact, any kind of formal or informal musical sharing. And that happens across all situations, whether you're working with a class of students and you've got a group who's quite anxious about performing and there's a fear of failure and lots of other kind of things that emerge. So we're wondering really, when we put this together, about how to find resources that are flexible, and that's a key to what we're talking about today. So it's everything from a seven-year-old being asked to perform to Granny when they come to pick them up from their piano lesson, to things happening in class, to auditions, all of those kinds of things. So thinking of a performance very, very broadly, and our absolute belief that the practical things that you can do should help everybody. So
looking at what the common symptoms of music performance anxiety are, I've just put them on a slide here so that you can see them. And what we generally notice is that they can be split into three main areas. So the first area is very physiological in nature. So these are often the types of symptoms that you would commonly associate, and often are the very first things that you might notice, such things as dry mouth, tense muscles, racing heart, for example. And then following on from that, there are also then cognitive or thought-based symptoms that are very common too. So people doubting their ability, maybe having a total memory loss, constant worrying about perhaps a poor performance or a fear of failure. And then there's a third category of symptoms known as behavioural symptoms, and these are often what occur often as a result of the first two, but can occur just without the other two as well. So things like, for example, making mistakes, getting short-tempered with others, even getting a poor tone, for example, when performing. So we can see here that this chain of symptoms can often make it very, very difficult to perform. And you can see why when you just look at the physiology and the cognitive symptoms and the behavioural symptoms. So what we've done within our booklet is to ensure that we've devised strategies that can help your students cope with these kind of symptoms.
I think what's really important to remember is that lots of students have different kinds of symptoms at different points. And so what we're looking for here is finding strategies that can help your students, regardless of whether they have the physiological symptoms or whether they have the more behavioural symptoms. You know, we're trying to keep them motivated and finding things that will keep them kind of psychologically healthy.
Yeah, because if we don't, and if we just allow those symptoms to continue and we don't try to address them, then there are some significant consequences. These are not consequences that are necessarily guaranteed to happen or that will happen all the time. But again, within the categories that we just spoke about, you can get from a very physiological perspective, very much tighter muscles all the time. So that would then result in a need for, say, physiotherapy treatment, for example. Behaviourally, there's an impact there on how hard people would be willing to work. If they're constantly feeling uncomfortable, perhaps they might then just lose their enjoyment of what they're doing, and this can lead to stopping lessons and perhaps even stopping music in total. And from the thoughts aspect, it can happen that there may be a greater frequency of thoughts about failure, and over time you can get potential transfer into other domains, so that they start to question whether they're good enough in other areas of their life. And these are quite extreme versions, but by helping to handle the symptoms of performance anxiety earlier and helping to overcome it, you can actually transform what potentially is viewed as a very negative condition into something that can be quite useful and very positive going forward.
I think what we're very aware of is that with the exam culture in which we live, and that's not talking about music exams per se, but just the kind of accountability culture which particularly young people are brought up with, then that means that often they're bringing more and more stress and anxiety from outside into their music lessons. And I think sometimes the things that we're talking about here haven't been caused necessarily through music in the first place. We're trying to find ways to help you with the kinds of students that you'll be meeting day in, day out, regardless of what they're bringing with them.
Yeah. And again, this is what we come on to next, which is about the fact that musicians, music students, they don't operate in a social vacuum. The wider environment in which they're embedded can have quite a big impact on their experiences and their mental health. So within the book, this is from page 5, that there are other people in a student support network who can positively contribute to the development of these psychological skills. In particular, parents, carers and other family members. But music teachers also play an important role in helping others to understand how they can effectively support students. So with some of the strategies that we will look at as we go through this webinar, we'll be able to see that although you can implement some of these strategies yourself, they're also very handy in that you can work with parents and allow the parents to actually use those strategies in order to help their children.
When we talk about all students, we're thinking about music being something for everybody. So every child in school, we very much hope, is experiencing music education. So when we talk about music students, actually that's a very wide remit of students which we're working with and which you will be working with. We've thought about the idea of performance anxiety happening across lots of different time domains, I suppose. Thinking about the long term, so things that are kind of ongoing, and then that ramps up really 7 to 1 days prior to a performance. So when you wake up and go, oh, it's Thursday, I've got a performance next Tuesday. Oh, it's Friday, oh my goodness, it's nearly Tuesday. Saturday, it gets nearer and nearer. So the anxiety can ramp up in those 7 days before. And then, of course, there's the 24 hours leading directly up to it. And then there's the immediately prior to a performance, and then also during a performance, and the bit that's sometimes forgotten, the thing about after a performance. What we've tried to do with these resources is to help you to think about putting in psychological help for students as long-term considerations throughout their musical learning. And that's really where we start from. And what you see on the screen now, I appreciate it's quite small. It comes from one of the flowcharts. So one section of our materials is about long-term considerations. And the idea is looking through things like students' values, is their environment motivating, right down to, are you maximising your students' motivation? Are you helping them to reflect on their musical development? And if the answer is no, then it takes you to which strategy to go to. So it's kind of tried to be helpful in helping you to think about lots of different aspects of the long-term considerations. Excuse me. Similarly, with 7 to 1 days prior to a performance, we have a flowchart which asks questions again about things which may be prevalent at that particular time, and then that takes you to different strategies. And then third set, so it's all based on practical strategies, and the blue set, as you can see here, is for immediately before, during and after a performance, because I'm fairly sure I'm not the only person who's ever had students who've performed really, really well and then come out of their performance, and the next thing they do with kind of relief often is just burst into tears. So actually what happens straight after a performance is also very relevant. So as you can see, these are all linked to the practical strategies.
And when we're talking about the practical strategies, what we're talking about is ways and means that you can help students to cope with any of the symptoms and the anxiety that they may be occurring or that they may be experiencing. And all the strategies that we've placed within the resource are based on scientific evidence and are rigorously researched. So when we're looking at what the psychological constructs are that we'll be considering, well, for this webinar, we'll take a look at some examples of these strategies, and we'll look at, for example, the role of the social environment. We'll also consider the role of peers, so again, that wider environment aspect. We'll look at ways that you can help your students to build confidence. We'll look at how you can assist them through goal-setting procedures. There's also strategies in here that we'll look at for fear of failure, helping your students to focus their attention, because that's a really big psychological area for helping performers to achieve their best performance, is where they focus their attention, and trying to focus really more on the actual performance and the music rather than necessarily on the symptoms that they're experiencing. We will look at also preparation for performance, which feeds into the other psychological constructs, and we'll look at thoughts and emotions and effective ways that students can handle whatever the thoughts and the emotions are that they're experiencing. So to start with, we'll start with looking at part A of the resource, which is looking at long-term considerations. So these are strategies that you can embed within your teaching that will help alleviate and reduce music performance anxiety through your teaching over a longer period of time.
I suppose in some ways we're not suggesting that you say, oh, we've got these things for music performance anxiety, but actually somebody wrote a very nice tweet a couple of weeks ago about how lots of the strategies help children in their general life as well. So it's not that we're saying you put in place all of these things and you kind of say to them, now dear, there's something called music performance anxiety, perhaps you're suffering from it. It's actually more about trying to find ways to embed this stuff through your teaching to kind of help them to be able to transfer it into different situations. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go through some of these practical ways to do things. Here is the first one. So share with your students something you failed at in the past which made you grow as a musician. Now, we've done this on our practical courses, and it's been absolutely hilarious, some of the things that have come out from the teachers that we've worked with. But what's been really interesting is that at the time, a lot of these experiences were absolutely mortifying and felt like the end of the world. But then with the kind of idea of time going on, people have been able to look back at them differently. And I suppose from my perspective, the most interesting thing about this was when we ran a course with some instrumental teachers and the sixth form students in this particular area. And we got the sixth form students to sit and hear what the teachers had to say. And actually, of all of the things we did with them that day, the sixth form students said this was the most revelationary, because often your students look at you and think, oh, you know, that person, well, they don't really know what it feels like. They're absolutely perfect. Of course you are. But, you know, actually finding things that you can share with your students and trying to normalise the idea of failure. There's loads and loads of examples. They don't have to be little things even, you know, but sometimes it can be starting a piece of music too fast, forgetting where you've parked your car or where you're going to park, and then having to run to an exam and running out of breath so that when you get there you can't actually finish the exam. There's all sorts of things along the way, and I mean, if I had to sit here and start talking about my own normalising failures, well, we could be here for a while, so we're going to move on.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. So we've all got those, and another helpful way to lessen the impact, if you like, of performance anxiety is to just to review perhaps how you're setting goals with your students. And a useful way to think about this is to always think about, am I really effectively rewarding the effort that comes through? So we've got down here a table which looks at the three different types of goals that can be set. And the most effective way to help progression and to help psychological development is to set a good mixture of these types of goals. So often the immediate goals that come out are often outcome based. So particularly parents will be wanting their students to pass a certain grade of music by a certain date, and that's a very outcome oriented goal.
That could also happen in school with, depending on, some schools now share no grades, which is absolutely fantastic, and they do everything through comments. But if they don't, then outcome goals can often be the things that get in the way.
Yeah, and moving into the second section there, we've got process goals there, which are really focused more around what the individual can achieve and develop, the type of skills that they need to develop. So, for example, a guitarist is able to change between chords more fluently than they were before. So those are very much based on the ways and means of getting to the outcome, if you like. And finally, there's performance type goals. So these are extremely good when it comes to, say, students who are very concerned about how they're comparing with others. So performance goals are referenced to the individual. So it would be a student comparing themselves with the previous performance level. So for example, here, a pianist will be able to play the final section of music more fluently than they could 2 weeks earlier, which is again just referenced back to how they were performing themselves rather than how somebody else was performing.
There's something in here also about putting things through a really, really positive lens, I think, and helping students to have little things to look forward to along the way and to kind of keep revisiting their own work. So moving on to the next one, this is massive in education, social comparison. It can be a real problem, especially as I was talking about earlier in exam culture or anything to do with numbers, where for somebody they've made real strives and kind of really moved their own learning forward, but actually then they look at the person next to them and go, well, they've got something that I haven't got. And so social comparison right across education, let alone music education, is a real hindrance. So the things that we're suggesting are around developing strong role models by comparison with others. So looking at others and thinking, what is it that these role models do well? So what is it that I really like about that? So trying to put these into positive ways and then working on how your student can develop these behaviours for themselves. So therefore reinforcing that development and trying to pick out specifics from that.
Yeah, and that's crucial, is to look at, because social comparison will happen whether you're hoping for it or not. It's just a natural thing that happens with all human beings. We always compare ourselves to others. All we're saying here with this one is just finding a way to make that much more positive focus rather than the normal negative focus that often happens.
So that's just a kind of dip into the long-term strategies. What we're going to do now is look at some of the things for 7 days to 1 day prior to a performance. And the first thing we're going to look at is this one here, which is about planning what you're going to do And that's if the performance is kind of known to be in a certain amount of time. So for example, it might be an examination, or it might be that they're doing something in school. Thinking about what you might do, what's your timetable for that, which might seem quite heavy-handed. It depends really on what the level and the actual event that they're working towards might be. But lots of teachers do this already. And the idea of this is it keeps the attention and focus on what it is that you're planning to do during the week.
Yeah, and again, like I said earlier, keeping that focus of the attention on the really important things that are helpful for music performance makes a big difference. And this is another way here, using what we call staircase goals. And staircase goals are a really effective and behavioural strategy to help keep students' attention focused, largely in the shorter term. So if we take this example, we can start at the bottom left-hand corner where it says current performance, and you can put in there what the current performance is of the student, and then jump forward into the long-term goal aspect. On this example, for example, in the top right-hand corner, we've got to pass the grade 3 examination, but it could be any other type of longer-term goal, which is coming up in the next 7 days.
So you need to put that into perspective before you start. So the first thing, if you've drawn out a long-term goal, your long-term goal is a week away. And actually, to put this into perspective, the first thing you need to do is pick up a pen and draw another step on the top, so that students can see that there is somewhere that after the grade 3 exam, and there is somewhere that they came from, and they didn't just parachute into this 7 days.
Yeah, and so that it can see that it's continuous and it carries on afterwards. But for the purpose of this exercise, the long-term goal is that 7-day performance that's coming up. And then you can either start at the bottom and work your way up, setting little behavioural goals that can be observed and achieved over the course of those 7 days. Or you can start at the top, and sometimes it's easier to do this, to start at the top right and work your way back down the steps. So you could say, well, what would it be really useful for my student to be able to do 2 days before this performance? And then work your way back from there. The second goal, what would it be really useful for my student to be able to do 4 days before this performance? And then the first goal, what would be a really effective behavioural goal for my student to do 7 days before this performance? And what it's doing is it's asking your students to keep their attention focused in the very short term. If we don't have those kind of goals in mind, what we can think about doing is that the students will be thinking, oh, I've got that performance in 7 days' time, oh, it's next Wednesday, I'm not prepared for it, oh, but it's okay, it's 7 days away. And then 2 days later, they'll be like, oh yeah, of course I've got that performance, oh no, that's really good, that's really bad, I haven't really performed for that before, I'm really nervous. And where the focus then starts to be is that it's focused on their emotions and their thoughts on what they're experiencing, rather than necessarily on what they need to focus on to perform well. So this is just a way of bringing that back to what they need to perform
Underpinning
well.
the staircase goals is the idea that there are strategies that you will have hopefully helped them with that can help them to reach the next step. So for example, if a student can play something really well and then about 7 days or 2 weeks before their exam, they keep stopping and saying sorry, you need to look at the reasons for why that might happen and give them little things which they might do along the way to kind of put that in place. I suppose the best one we actually thieved from somebody else on the saying sorry was a guitar teacher up in Scotland who came on one of our courses who said, oh yes, I have a student exactly like the one you were describing on the case study that we used. Kept saying sorry, kept stopping, kept saying sorry. And he said to this particular student, and he clearly knew them very well, if I hear sorry, the word sorry, I'll have £1 off you, please. And then for every time you say sorry, I'll have £1. And it just was a way of, you know, in a joking way, because there was a good relationship already between the two, of having that. But actually, you know, those kinds of things are the things you need to help to make the performance as good as it can be. So lots of our strategies come under what we might call the psychology of common sense, but actually having familiarity with the performance venue or not having familiarity with the performance venue can be really, really stress inducing, because you're kind of walking in and you don't know what you're walking into. So as it says here from page 30, a lot of performance anxiety relates to the unknown, and that's unknown. What's the examiner going to look like? What's the room going to look like? What's the piano going to be like that I'm going to have to play? It's helpful to try and make the practice area as similar as possible to the upcoming performance arena, which might not always be possible because, you know, we can't recreate the Albert Hall in our front room, but there are ways in which we can help bring the Albert Hall into our front room or the exam room or whatever it may be. And I know, for example, that Trinity now, helpfully, I understand, have pictures of the examiners and also the examination rooms, so that when students are mentally preparing for performance, you can show them the pictures, and although you can't necessarily take them inside, then they can actually experience for themselves what it kind of feels like. Something else I wanted to throw in with the performance venue is the idea that what you wear needs to be comfortable, and it also needs to have, you need to have got your students to kind of wear it beforehand, so that when they, you know, go in and do the exam or play in front, you know, wherever it is they're going to be, that they've actually worn those shoes before and they realise that the foot is going to keep slipping off the pedal is not a good time to do that. So actually, you know, thinking about the performance as the whole person before you go in is really, really helpful.
And so also within the strategies that we put in the booklet is that we thought, well, oftentimes with music performance anxieties, there's a real heavy focus on things that they can't do or things that they're not sure about or uncertain about, and things that feel quite negative or unhelpful in the first instance. And actually, you know, when you're coming up to a performance time, there's a lot of key strengths and things that students do well, which they will then oftentimes forget to think about and forget to reflect on. And these key strengths that they have are a really useful source of confidence, particularly in the build-up to a performance. So we just put in there, for example, this worksheet, which can be very easily completed with the student, just discussing it with the student and asking them to complete these parts here, so that they understand that there are things that they do really well, and when doing that, they're happy, you know, that their confidence is being built as well. So having built their confidence and got them into a much better position coming up to the performance itself, we'll now move on to the final part of the booklet, which is about the time immediately before, during and after the performance. So what we're talking about here is the 24 hours leading up to a performance and then during and after the performance, excuse me. And we'll start really with something which, you know, as music teachers, it may not well be within your control, but just talking again to the wider environment, so potentially to parents, to carers, to the students themselves, is just helping with nutrition and hydration. And really just something very straightforward is to be able to eat and drink a well-balanced meal 2 hours prior to performance. And what we're talking about there is, you know, a meal that includes complex carbohydrates such as, you know, rice, pasta, potatoes, they're common complex carbohydrates, perhaps some protein within there, depending on the diet of the student, and also some water for hydration. And now these are all important because they help with maintaining concentration and attention during a performance. So they don't want to rumble in the stomach when they're just getting ready to perform or while they're halfway through the performance either. So it's just something that can be worked with the parents as well.
So on to the next strategy. I really should do this myself more often. A day of performance checklist. That's for sure. Thank you, dear. And so, again, it's another of those common sense things, but the idea of a checklist is that your students would own this for themselves and that they don't get halfway to wherever it is they're supposed to be going, to their concert, and they go, oh, actually, I don't think I put my bow in the case. Or, oh, I'm not sure I've got the correct clothing, or whatever it may be. So Having details of your performance location, knowing where it is, maybe have been there before, but having all of these things that you may require and kind of checking it off before you go. And this again is something that parents can help with, and it's essential really, because otherwise when you should be mentally preparing for a performance, whatever it may be, actually you're just sitting there stressing about whether you've got something or whether you forgot to bring the music with you, or whatever it may be. So again, another of those common sense ones, but really quick. The next one is about the confidence about entering a performance arena. And again, although we've put some of these strategies fit across multiple time frames really, and this is definitely one of them, but thinking about what are you going to do when you go in, because your musical performance often begins long before the first note is played. That's not just about entering the arena, but also within a piece of music you might have 16 bars to wait actually before you join in. So kind of thinking about those kind of things too, which there are some other strategies for in the booklet around pre-performance routines. But I would say work with your students and have fun role playing how they enter the performance arena. And a lot of students, when they go into things like concerts, they need to know that the audience is actually there to support them. So it's a really scary thing having them and then having an audience. So trying to get them to think about the role of the audience being there. Where this is most difficult actually though is in auditions, which are widely thought across academic research to be one of the most stressful situations that a musician can put themselves into. And that's because generally there is no feedback. You kind of either look at blank faces or smiley faces, but you can't actually read them, and you don't get that instant feedback that you do. But if you can help them knowing how to enter the performance arena, whatever it may be, it can build their confidence and help the performance go well. And what I really wanted to talk about here was some of the ways in which the performance arena can be right here, right now. So certainly in a classroom situation, it's about creating an environment where there's a supportive culture and children support each other and are willing to take risks. And I think also having the flexibility to be able to put performances or have performances in different ways. So the performance might be something that they've, for example, recorded on an iPad in a practice room, and then they take in and they show that performance rather than right now having to stand up and do that. So having some kind of flexibility about those kind of things, and some idea of the performance arena being a very flexible space is very important.
Yeah, and following on from that is about moving on to looking at what you can do during a performance. It's about, when thinking about a psychological strategy for helping during performance, what we're thinking about is what happens if something actually goes wrong, which distracts the attention away from the performer and where they are, to the thing that's just gone wrong. And
or the rumbling stomach, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, if they haven't eaten and drunk enough. So whatever it is that may have taken their attention away, what's really needed psychologically is just some way of being able to get that attention right back to the present moment. So it's recognising that something's not gone quite to plan, but then bringing it right back to the present moment. And something, as we say there, just a keyword, something like maybe here or back or now, just something there which really acts to grab the attention immediately back from wherever it's gone to. So if you say those words yourself, to yourself for a minute, you can just be straight back in the present moment, no matter where your mind might well have been wandering to. And as Ali was saying, it's important that these, obviously you can't practice this at the moment during a performance. So it's important to practice, say, having a full performance and putting the proviso in that if something goes wrong during that practice of the performance, you will use one of these keywords to bring you back to the present moment.
I think there's something really important in there which is well known across learning as well, in that you definitely need to have practice performances. So practice is something, a performance is something else, and then you have this kind of halfway house which you kind of flick in and out of having practice performances, and putting those in place is a really, really good idea too. And so from the last practical thing we want to look at today, and of course we've got many more in our toolkit and our other resource, which we're going to talk about in a minute as well, is this idea of having a post-performance rubbish bin. So effectively, as somebody comes out, so you have immediate emotional thoughts about a performance, how it went, how it, it might not have gone, like I was talking about earlier, it's gone really well, but there's still tears. So my suggestion is that you grab a pad of paper and a pen, and you ask the person who's done the performance, if they're looking or feeling a little bit stressed, to write down on a piece of paper just one of the things that they want to get out of their head to externalise it, and they just basically screw it up, chuck it in the bin, and then you give them another piece of paper and another one until they've finished. Hopefully not too many pieces of paper and a very thin pad, but the idea is that they write down their thoughts and emotions related to this straight afterwards. And that isn't to say that you shouldn't evaluate a performance, but it is to say that sometimes evaluating it here and now is not the best way to do that. And so just having a way to kind of get those things out of somebody's head and picking them up later.
Yeah, is really crucial. So coming on to the conclusions, what we've tried to do with this resource, really, I know it can feel like you've already got a very overloaded workload, and and you wonder how you can ever possibly fit in even more, particularly around psychology and mental aspects of performance. But we've tried to make the resource as easy reading, as helpful as possible. And to help you with that, it's a bit like a circle, really, and a cycle of how you can use the resource. So it's a case of looking and trying to spot the symptoms if possible. Once you've done that, you can then refer to the flowcharts contained within the resource itself, which themselves will then refer you to certain strategies throughout the book, and then you can incorporate those strategies and practice them in the practice sessions before moving on to evaluate the effectiveness of any particular strategy or strategies that you've chosen. And then finally to reflect and refine the process again. But it's all about, using those strategies, putting them in place, trying them, modifying them. They're not immediately just pick up and use it and it's really rigid. What we're saying is use that, and if you need to modify it in some way, then for sure, use that, modify it however you feel it works for whichever student you're working with.
You will find that there are certain strategies that don't work for certain students. We are all so very, very different. And so, there's a bit of trial and error involved in this as well. I think going around trying to work out, whether some students like imagery things or whether others hate them, so there's lots of strategies there for you to be able to kind of go and try things out. I suppose the other thing that occurred to me always when I'm working with teachers is lots already. You do lots already, so it's not about saying chuck out what you already do. It's about saying enhance what you already do. And our own view is that psychological skills are not sticking plasters, but they are in fact long-term mechanisms designed to enhance performance. And therefore we consider these to be really, really important, and things that hopefully we are helping our students, whatever age and whatever their ambition and whatever their skill level, to be able to enjoy their music making more. And often the thing that gets in the way, apart from time, I think a lot of teachers do consider psychological skills to be important, but actually they kind of wonder how they're going to fit that into a half an hour lesson when they've already got lots and lots to fit into it. But it's often our minds that prevent us from practicing these strategies as well. And it's the same with the students. It's often their minds that stop them from actually going ahead and doing things. But I would say do it now. Don't leave it until the last minute. Try and think about very small things that you can do, drip feed, drip feed, drip feed into lessons. And as Greg said, having fun with the strategies so that they're flexible and malleable. They're not supposed to be something that we wrote down and then they stay in exactly the same form as they are, and there's a purist approach to it. And we've had amazing individual kind of feedback, I suppose, from lots of the courses and things that we've run, where people have gone, I had this student and now I'm trying this and this has really happened. So, and I've adapted it in this way, and finding things that work for them. So just to remind you, there's a question box at the bottom, and once you've finished hearing me rambling on about the final few slides, we're going to be taking a few questions. But we called our other resource Play for the very reason that we want you to be playful. And the second resource, the other resource that we've put up here, is also available on the ISM website. Quick plug there. So this was the second thing we wrote on music performance anxiety, and it's got lots of vignettes in, and again lots and lots of practical things. It's aimed more for the person who's musically learning rather than the toolkit which we've talked about today, which is specifically for teachers to be able to help students and the people that support them. Just a few things I kind of wanted to finish off with. I think that as music teachers, and I'm talking here about music teachers in schools and out of schools, we need to have more flexibility around performance and how we perceive performance and how we put the structures in place. For example, I know that it can be really inducing for some students to have a GCSE performance day. We're having it next Tuesday and everybody will perform and your slot is at 11:10. And actually it's not a requirement of the specifications that happens. And so, you know, if we can find flexibility and helping students to do their best at times when they are kind of musically and psychologically ready for things, which might be earlier, in fact, then I think that'd be a really good way to go forward. We're looking to create, as I was saying earlier, an environment that is supportive and helps all students to take risks and to carry on with their musical learning and kind of have some ownership over it. And I think a lot of the times students have a blip in their learning, and that's kind of the end of it. They need us, and a lot of students also stick with musical learning because they want that one-to-one time with somebody, and they want to come along and feel worthy and feel competent and feel that they can do something. And I know that as an army of teachers, you are absolutely amazing at doing that. So I hope that can carry on and carry on. So just to finish off really before the questions, we've got some references on the end, but I won't flick to that slide because this one looks more exciting. You can get all of these resources and lots of other exciting resources around curriculum and all sorts of other things from the ISM via their website, or you can ask some of their lovely staff who've set up this webinar for us today. We've worked all over the place with this work. As I was saying earlier, we worked with music education hubs, we've worked with schools. From time to time, we've run whole day intensive courses here at the ISM. We've worked with things like the Composers Collective at the South Bank. We would love to do more of this kind of work. And also, as I was saying earlier, Greg's a HCPC registered sport and exercise psychologist. And therefore, he can very much work in that domain. All of the work which we have put together is really underpinned by rigorous psychological research and draws from lots and lots of different things. Have you got anything you want to say before we go to questions?
Just really we know there's been some great downloads on both resources, and we're really excited for people to be using these resources because, you know, we designed them on a very practical basis so that everybody would use them, and try to make them really as available as possible.
So we've got a few questions starting to come in, which is great. So first of all, a question from Janet. Thank you, Janet. So Greg, I'm going to ask you this. Is there any particular age or skill level where music performance anxiety appears? Janet says, I work a lot with teenagers and noticed that some of them seem to develop in their mid to late teens, having been confident performers up until then.
Yeah, that is quite a common time. I mean, we know that the teenage years are very much a time of change and transformation, and around that time you also get a lot of the self starts to really come, the identity of the teenagers, who they are, who they want to be, and all those challenges start to come in, which is why you then start to get the issues arising with them challenging what they're doing at any particular time. And they also, around that age, start to become much more aware of the social environment, aware of their friends, of their colleagues, of what's happening, how other people are developing. So that constant social comparison taking place. I mean, generally, it can happen earlier, that you may start to notice music performance anxiety at a slightly earlier age, but generally it will start to develop a little bit more once they start to move towards the teenage years.
That's not to say that all teenagers or will suffer from that, or that they may have grown out of it and had it when they were younger, as we sometimes often see. But I think one of the things that we have to remember is that musical learning contributes an awful lot to a child, and the skills that we embed help them across lots of other aspects of their lives as well. It's great to know that the teenagers are still coming to their musical learning, and you're trying to find different ways to help them. So our next question comes from Vicky, and Vicky says, I heard a teacher say that sometimes focusing on symptoms in a mindful way can help. Greg, would you agree?
Yeah, so mindfulness is very prevalent nowadays in society in general, and mindfulness is basically just paying particular attention to something in a non-judgmental way. So it means if, for example, you've got a symptom of, say, a racing heart, being mindful of that would be to, say, really focusing your attention on that racing heart, and perhaps utilising a strategy that we have in the resource actually, which is about just focusing on your breathing and breathing out for longer than you breathe in, which helps to then slow down that racing heart. And being mindful in the first instance allows your students to pick up on what is actually happening within themselves. And the resource that we had previously, the play resource, then the play resource, what we've done in there is we've put in there a mindful body check, which is basically like if you imagine an X-ray scanner going down the body. You're just asking the musician to just focus on what's happening in the body at that particular time and bringing the attention to it. So certainly focusing on the symptoms in a mindful way can help, but largely it will help in a way of identifying that those symptoms are happening and then trying to put in place a lot of the resources and strategies we've devised here. So thanks for that question.
Okay. We're kind of rolling towards the end, really. Have you got any closing comments, Greg, something that you wanted to add in, or one of those questions from there?
Well, Peter was saying on here that he works across different age groups, and he was wondering whether these strategies can be used with all age groups. And what we've done within the resource, within the music performance anxiety resource, is to provide modifications on certain strategies. So, for example, one of our strategies that we have within there is, say, a guided imagery script, which is a way of saying, well, imagine if you just close your eyes and use your imagination to imagine yourself performing and imagine what it's going to feel like, etc. So using one of those, we have one for teenage sort of age group and one for a younger age group. And we've also done that with, say, relaxation strategies as well. So we have strategies in there that we have modified ourselves that would then be appropriate for different age groups, but also within those strategies you can play around with them and modify them as you think is appropriate, not just necessarily for age, but also for the individual that you're working with.
We know that it's really important that things like language, you would talk to a 7-year-old very differently to how you might talk to a 12-year-old, to a 16-year-old, to a young adult, to an older adult, to an old person. You know, musical learning, as we talked about, is for everybody, and it's about finding ways in which you can adapt things to help them get the best, whatever their level of kind of engagement is at that particular time, I guess.
Yeah.
As we finish, I just wanted to say, actually, we've just got something here from Scott. So Scott, thank you for joining us. There will be a replay sent out to, or available at least, to view on the website from the whenever the amazing team here can get it up. So just as we finish, I know Greg would join me in saying a massive thank you to the ISM Trust for thoroughly supporting this work. We feel that it's very important. They feel that it's very important. And over the last few years, they've really helped us to help teachers and help musicians, whatever phase they are of their learning, to be able to get the most out of their musical learning. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Please do go and have a look at our resources, and also feel free to send us through any questions you may have, and keep your eyes open for other things that we may be doing around the country in the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.